And welcome to week 9 of website development. You don't get to see my video this time because apparently it was messing up the audio, so oh well, you know what I look like, or it doesn't really matter. But this week I'm happy to have moved past the midterm because we get to talk about some pretty exciting stuff this week. We're going to talk about how CSS gets used for layout purposes. So a lot of what we've talked about with CSS just changes sort of colors, fonts, how text is presented, but we really haven't gotten into the layout stuff, and that's what we're going to get into this week. Before I do, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the developer tools that are built into web browsers, though, because as you get further into things, knowing about these tools can be really helpful. So in the notes, I talk about different ways to do it in different browsers, but I'm in Firefox here, and I can just hit F12. I can also go up here and you see a developer icon here. And that's where I get them. And by default, the developer tools will open a panel at the bottom of the screen, which you can resize. You can also have it as a separate window. It's especially useful if you have two monitors or something, so you can have the developer tools on one screen and the actual website on the other. So when you have the developer tools up, and this is going to be a little different in different browsers, but the basic concepts are the same. There's going to be some icon. Sometimes it will be a magnifying glass. Here it's the little arrow pointing to things, but this allows you to select an element that's on the page. So you see, once I click that, when I move my mouse around the page, it will highlight different things. So let's choose this click on this main title here. And you see that down below then, it's highlighted this H1 class equals course title, V15 FA website development. So it's found this in the code of my page, and you can scroll through the code and see where it is, and you can so you can see where it is in the code of the page. Also here then on the right, you the rules tab is going to be the one that's selected by default. Once again, the naming is going to be slightly different in different browsers, but this tab will show you the CSS rules that are affecting that. So you can also then go in and change things in here, which is really useful. So you see that here's the code for H1. It gives a font size of 32 pixels. Let's say we wanted to see what it would look like with bigger H1s. I can just change that in there. I can also add in new rules here. So color blanched almond. No, that doesn't work. Oh, it's because you see when I changed it here, it was crossed out, and that's because there's this other rule here that is overriding it. Here, we'll go to the blanched almond here as well. So you can see you can make changes to your CSS in real time here, and it updates it on the page. And this is really good for playing with CSS to try to change what you figure out what you need to change. Changes that you make here are not actually saved anywhere. So if I just hit reload on the page, you'll see that everything will go back to normal. So this is a place to play with your CSS, but if you decide you really want all of your H1s to be red, then you're going to have to go into your CSS file and change it there. So this is just this. The browser tools here are really just for playing with things. And there are lots of other developer tools hidden, features in the developer tools here, but really this ability to see and browse the code on the left here, and the ability to change CSS rules on the right here are the sort of basic starting point that is that I like to play with. So let me close this for now and talk a little bit about how things get laid out with CSS. So really the first step here is to think about what's known as the CSS box model. And I have copied a diagram from the textbook and the notes here, because it lays it out pretty well. Basically, any HTML element can be considered a box. And there are different parts of the box. So there's this content area, and the content area is what is actually the actual content of the element. So let's look at an example. So I'm going to start a new page here. It's going to be here. We're going to grab the I'm going to start with this minimal HTML5 document. So I have the basics I need, and then I'm going to inside it here add a paragraph. This is a paragraph. Oh, I can't spell. Okay. Okay. So this is, oh, did I save that? I saved it as a CSS file. That's weird. Okay, it should be an HTML file. Now let's view it in the browser. Okay, so going back to our diagram here, the content area in this case is just the actual text. So pretty much what you get if you highlight it there. You can also then consider that there is, but think about putting a border around the image. And so we'll go into add some CSS for this. So paragraph, I'm going to give a border of 1 pixel, solid black. And we'll talk a bit more about, I can't spell very well today at all. Talk a bit more about the format for borders in CSS in a bit here, but just get that in place. Why is, oh, I forgot colon. Okay, so by default, the content area then is going to be the text. And when you remember when we talked about block elements take up the entire width of the page, so you can see that the content area actually stretches all the way across the page by default. And then there's this border here, and any space between the content area and the border is known as the padding area. And that can also be controlled with CSS then. So I can just say padding 1 EM. I'm going to add this into the styles for the paragraph here. We'll style it like this. Okay, so now we have a border and we have a padding between the content area and the border. So if I go in, reload that, you can see that there's now this space between the content area and the border. So one thing to note is if you have a background color, say, it's going to extend all the way to that border and include the padding. We'll give a so outside of the padding area, outside of the border then, there is what's known as a margin. And this really has to do with when you have more than one element that are next to each other. So let's say if I have 2 different elements, 2 different paragraphs, you'll see that there's this space between them, and that's what's known as this margin here. One thing to note is that margins overlap on adjacent elements here. What that means is that the margin, here, let's give an example here. We'll set our margin equal to 2 EM. Okay, the thing to note here is that you have this margin of 2 EM all the way around each of these paragraphs. But between the 2 paragraphs, it's just 2 EM there. It's not 4 EM, so they don't over the margins on adjacent things can overlap. So whichever the top margin of one or the bottom margin of the other is the biggest will be the space between them. So let's talk a little bit about how to adjust different things in that box. We have a couple different CSS things already here, but the basic most basic thing is, so going back to the box model here, this one, so that content area, that can actually be adjusted with the height and the width attribute, or height and the width rules in CSS. So I could actually go in and say that, let's just say we only want our paragraphs to take up half the page. I could set width 50% to that. And then when I go in and look at this, all of those will shrink to half the page. I could also then use numbers for any specific numbers for any of these. I can also give, I can do percentages, I can do EMs. If I decided I wanted the height of everything to be 100 pixels, I could do that. Well, if you have more, though it makes sense usually to have your content control how the height of things. So one thing to note is that when you're setting the height and the width of things, it's going to be the height and the width of this content area, which doesn't include the padding here, which can get confusing sometimes when you're doing, when you're trying to figure out how to fit doing layout and fitting things in. One thing to know is that this is changing in CSS. So in CSS3, you're going to be able to change how it computes the size of things to include the padding and the borders. I think this is something that you probably should. You can experiment with, but I probably wouldn't use it at this point, just because there's still a fair number of browsers out there that are not supporting CSS3. But this is definitely something that pretty soon you'll be able to do. And there's more on in your book on this, page 309, which is worth looking at. So let's take a look then at the borders and the padding and all that. One thing to note is that you can have different padding on the or borders or margins on the top and the bottom of things. So I can have padding top 1 EM, padding left 2 EM, padding right 75%. Padding bottom 0. So you can go in and have separate padding for different sides of things, and you do it with the padding left, padding right, padding bottom, etc. Except you have to spell them right for it to work. And note that there's a dash between these. Let me zoom in. A dash here between padding and then what side you want it on. There's also a shortcut where you can combine all of these. So if you just have padding and then the top, then the right, then the bottom, and then the left, it's going to be the same as having those out. And you can remember that using the mnemonic trouble, TRBL, for top, right, bottom, and left. So this top, this is right, this is bottom, and this is left. Okay, so remember my width is 50%, but then I have a padding on the right of 75%, and remember that padding is not included in the width by default, and that's why that looks so strange. Let's just do something more logical here. 3 pixels. Okay. So that's how you control things on different sides. You could do the same thing with margins here. Borders are a little bit different because there are some separate border properties. And you'll see here that I have just border, but there are different ways to do this. So you can start with, so there's a border width, There's a border color. And a border style. And these you're generally going to need. And border width just uses any of the units of measurement we've talked about. Border color is pretty self-explanatory as well. So you could do you can use a hex code, or you can use names. Border style. This is you don't see these used that much, but there are some different options. You can have solid lines, double lines, dotted lines, dashed lines. There's a list on your book on page 317 of all of them, showing what they look like and everything. You know, let's use one of the rarer ones here: border style dotted. And then, okay, so you see here's a dotted border. We didn't spell border right. I really am not doing well with my... So that's quite a border. And so what I had earlier was sort of a shortcut shorthand border style, which you can collapse these three different things into one rule. And then it's just border. So you do it in the order width, style, and then color. This is going to be the same. So there's also a new one that's is pretty popular, and that's border radius. You're going to have that separate from your shorthand at this point. This is only going to work in newer browsers, but pretty much any newer browser is going to do it. And what this does is give curved corners to boxes. And the number in there will be, it's the radius of a circle that describes how this is curved. But basically, smaller the units are there, or the bigger the units, the more rounded off the corner. So if I have just like 5 pixels there, you'll see they're slightly only slightly rounded. But if I go to 50, it's going to be a lot more rounded. So that's border radius. It's definitely a popular thing these days. There's also a border image, but this is pretty new. It's sort of experimental at this point. You might want to play with it. The details are in your books, but it's not something you're going to really be using much these days yet. And talked about margins. Margins are specified pretty much exactly like padding here. The one thing to remember, of course, is that margins in things that are next to each other can overlap. One thing to note is, so I have 4 different values here. You can also have just 2 values. And so you'll notice that the 4 is actually on the left and the right, and the 2 is on the top and the bottom. So if you just have 2 numbers here, this is the top and the bottom, and this is the right and the left. If you have 4 numbers, once again, this is the top, this is the right, this is the bottom, and this is the left, that you can remember from Trouble, TRBL. Okay, so another thing that, so let's talk about how these then can get moved around. So you'll notice that still we have everything sort of down in a row down the left of the page. Let's say we want these two things side by side. Basic way that the way that's generally done is by using the float rule in CSS. So a couple things to remember. So if you float an element, it moves it as far to the either left or right as possible until it bumps into something else. And then everything else wraps around it. But this all happens within whatever element is containing it. And we can get to what that means later. So let's say, start just by adding float left to our paragraphs here. And I reload this, and a little bit changes, but not a whole lot. So what's so think about this top paragraph here, floating towards the left until it bumps up against its margin here, and then everything else tries to wrap around it. Like imagine when you insert an image into a Word document and set it so things wrap around it. So this second paragraph would go up there, except there's not quite enough room. But let's make these things smaller. Let's change the width. So it's 30% there. Then still not wrapping around. Let's get rid of get our margins down a bit. Now we have enough room for them both to fit there. And let's label our paragraph. Okay, so paragraph 1 floats to the left, paragraph 2 goes up beside it there. Let's think about what would happen if I changed this to float right then. In that case, you'll see that the numbers switch and everything's sort of shifted over to the right. That's because this first paragraph floats to the right, and then everything else tries to wrap around it, and this second paragraph is also floating to the right there. You could also have these two things floated differently, but you don't really need to do that to get things to work. Okay, so let's say after those paragraphs, we have a header. So you'll see that even though this is down under those, it's still showing up at the top there. And that's because, remember, things try to wrap around floated elements. So this is, since there's more space to the left here, it's trying to fill in this space. If we don't want it to do that, we have to do what's called clearing the float. And so if you want it to stop wrapping around something you've floated, you have to use the clear command, CSS rule. So let's give our H2 a rule of clear right. And that means it's going to stop. It's going to drop down to where there's nothing to floated to the right of it, basically. So now it will drop down below those. So that's how to stop things from floating once you've established floats. And you can clear left, clear right, or clear both if you need to. So that's floating. That's actually how most layout is done on the web. And it's sort of a confusing thing to wrap your head around. I'm going to have you go through the exercises in the book for this, because they'll help a lot before I have you do it on your own sites. But yeah, there's some basic conceptual stuff that you have to wrap your head around before thinking about layout, and these terms make sense. There's one other way of controlling how things show up on web pages, or where things show up, and that's what's called positioning. So the normal position the normal setting for the position property for things is called static, and that's means things show up where you expect them to show up given the floating and all that. There's also position relative. Let's do this, play with this with our H2 here. So I can add position relative to the H2, and on its own, it shouldn't do anything. But we'll see here. Nope. But what that gives us the ability to do is move that thing around relative to where it is by default. And you can do that by specifying how far it should move away from different directions. So if I say top 5 EM, what that actually is going to do is move it 5 EM away from the top. It moves it down, which is a bit counterintuitive, but you'll get the hang of it. So top means move down, and bottom means move up. So, and then move it to move it to the right. Say I could give it a sort of a left here. Did I change? I did something weird. I don't know why changing. Oh, I see. I'm just, it's just making my page scroll there. So yeah, and that's because if let's go into those browser tools here. and select this. And remember the box model here? We can see that you can use the box model tab in your in the developer tools to look at what the box for something is. And we can see here that the box for that header actually takes up the entire width. So when then I moved that to the right, it made the whole page bigger because it still took up the same width. I could change that. Let's give our H2 a width. Another thing that's sort of useful sometimes is use max width, because then you can then it can get to a certain point, and then content with it, and it will start wrapping after that point, and that's sometimes useful. Okay, so yeah, that then got rid of the fact that it made the screen bigger. The other thing to realize about this position relative is that if there is more content, let's just get rid of those for now and add a third paragraph. By default, here we're going to float this paragraph to the left, actually, or not have it float. Okay, so I add a class to that called no float to this, and then I can write a rule for that class and go float none. And that means that theoretically this paragraph is not going to float. Yeah. So then, once again, the thing to notice about this, when the relative positioning. So this is the default positioning of this header. And you see it takes up a certain amount of space. It takes up this space. If we add the positioning rules back in there, you'll see that that space it took up is still open there. It's still blank, but the paragraph itself has moved down to here. And the thing about the relative positioning is it can overlap other things, as you see here. So that's relative positioning, and so you'll see that used for various things, and I think when you go through the examples in the book, that it will become more obvious what that's sort of useful for. But let's talk a bit about position absolute. So position absolute. Let's wonder what. There's a lot of puzzling things that happen in CSS here. I wonder why that went up there. Let's see if I can use this to figure out why. Well, I'm going to just get rid of this no float there. It's confusing things. Things can really sometimes get puzzling when you're doing CSS layout, and there's a fair amount of trial and error involved with it. Even for somebody like me, it's been doing doing it a long time. So don't worry if you get confused, and I'll work with you to sort things out. Okay, so I changed that to position absolute, and you see it bounced it back up to the top there. Position absolute means that it places the element to specific coordinates within the containing block or element, which is generally the browser window itself. So position absolute by itself just makes things move to the top left corner. And the other thing to note is that the space that this would have taken up down in here is actually not there anymore. Let's change things to float left. It will be more obvious there what's going on. Okay, so you see there's no longer a space between here like there would be if I didn't have the position absolute. So if I pull it out, it shows here, and it takes up some space. I put the position absolute back in, it gives up that space and goes to the top left corner. And then we can move it from that top left corner with the same top left right rules we did with relative positioning. So add those in. You'll see it's over there at this point. I forgot. And you can see that I can, one thing that's nice about these development tools is I'm actually just highlighting one of these and using the arrow keys on the keyboard to change the values. And if you're trying to position something in an exact spot, this can actually be really useful. But also remember that anything that's working with percentages will change as the browser window changes. So here, let's change this to 50%. Yeah, that might be nice. And remember, if I find something, if I'm playing with the browser tools and get to find values I want, I'll have to come back in here to change them. Okay, so that's that's fixed absolute positioning. There's also a absolute positioning, which is pretty similar to. I mean, there's fixed positioning, which is pretty similar to absolute positioning. See, if I just change it to fixed here, you're not going to see any difference. But if I happen to have more paragraphs, So you'll see that the difference is that when the page scrolls, fixed positioning stays in one place. With absolute positioning, on the other hand, it scrolls with the page. And this is actually pretty useful. It's something you're going to see whenever there's a web page where the menu or a header or something is always visible. Sorry about that. Okay, so that is positioning. To recap here, there's relative positioning, there's static positioning, which is normal, but you don't necessarily have to specify. There's relative position, which moves the element relative to its normal position, but the normal position is kept there as empty space. Then there's absolute positioning, which moves the element to specific coordinates, but the normal spot is then given up, and other things fill that space. And then there's fixed positioning, which is just like absolute positioning, but except things stay in one place when you scroll the document. Okay, so let's go quickly into an example of how this is going to work in practice. So how floats actually can be used to lay out a page. And actually, I have an example in your notes of sort of very simple a very simple layout that that uses floats to create a 2-column layout with a header and a footer. So let's go in and change this to match that. So let's say we're going to have a header at the top of our page. And inside a header, we probably are going to have an H1. And maybe we'll have some menus and other things, but we'll just leave it at that for now. And then let's put all of the rest of our page into a div. Remember, we talked about div being sort of a generic element that you use just mainly for purposes of attaching CSS to. So this is a good example of it. We'll give it a div ID equals main. So that will contain all the main content of our page. And then below that, let's have a footer. And our footer, we're going to have an aside, which will be like a sidebar on our website. And then in our footer, Remember, this is the copyright symbol. Okay, and we have some sort of footer on here. Okay, so first, our sidebar actually sort of looks like a sidebar there, but still, that's not the format we're going to use. First, let's go in and get rid of some of the weird formatting on other stuff. So, and start our formatting from scratch a bit. Okay, so first thing we're going to want to do, we probably don't need to float the header at all here, just because we want it to be at the top of the page, but let's give it a little bit of styling in here. We'll say, we'll center it. And we'll give it a background color. Okay, now we have a header. Looks like a header. Actually, let's see how there's this white margin around it. I want to get rid of the margin, so I'm just going to set margin equal to 0 as well. There's still a margin there. Let's see what that's coming from. So if we look here, oh, here I have to check to include browser styles. No, so oh, it looks like that margin at the top is actually on the body. So let's go in and add a rule here saying body margin 0 as well. Okay, and now looks like our H1 here. This is, we'll add in the H1 there. Sorry to get into this digression, but I wanted to have it without a border there. It will look better. While we're at it, let's give some padding to that. We'll say 2EM, space it out a bit. Okay, now it looks more like a header. Okay, so our main content will be this stuff over here. Probably don't need to do much to it other than give it a, let's give it a color so we can see where it is. We need our So remember, for an ID, you use a pound sign to specify it in the CSS. And then we have a background color for it. So we can see where it is at this point. So let's give it a bit of padding as well. Give it padding on the top at least. That will get rid of the that white there was because of the margin from this first paragraph. We should give it a color that can be seen over the blue, like pink on blue. Okay, so remember, we want to have this sidebar show up beside it. So the best way to do that probably is to float this main content to the left and give it some sort of set width so things can go beside it. So the first thing we'll do is give this a width of 60% or whatever. I'll actually play with the size of this a bit. Okay, so I remember I can go in and just play with my CSS in here. That looks like about what I want, so that's 71%. And then to make things wrap around it, what I'll need to do is add a float to this. So I'm just going to say float left. Doesn't seem to be. Wonder why float is not showing as one of the things that it's doing. Oh, it's not showing up when I view the. Did I not hit save? Oh, I just didn't hit save over here. Never mind. Okay, so now we have our sidebar content showing up right there. The only thing left to do then is to get our footer down to the bottom. And probably the easiest way to do that will be just to say footer and then clear the float. So oh, wrong button. Okay, and so now you see this is at the bottom. We could do various things with this. Give it a bit of padding. Give it some, get rid of that. Give it a color, whatever we want to do with that. And now you see get rid of this. Now you see that we have more of sort of a web page with some sort of layout that's just built with floats. And then you could add in more content in any of these locations. But you can see that that's the basic structure of a lot of websites right there. So yeah, there's going to be plenty more opportunity to play with this in the homework for this week. But it really is sort of an exciting development in to get into this stuff. And I hope that it allows you to make your sites a lot more exciting to be able to play with this stuff. So as always, if you have any questions about this, and this is sort of a tricky stage, feel free to get in touch with me and I'll work through things with you. I am also in the process of finalizing the milestone 4, and we'll be getting feedback to you from that in the next couple days. Think that's about it. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good week. Thanks a lot, everybody.